Several major publishers, along with education officials, are suing Florida over banned library books, arguing a Florida state law violates the First Amendment. The group includes publishers like Penguin Random House, Simon and Schuster, and HarperCollins. The law in question is Florida's 2023 education bill, HB 1069, which requires schools to remove a book if a parent or resident makes a complaint that it depicts sexual conduct. The publishers argue Florida has, quote, mandated that school districts impose a regime of strict censorship in school libraries. The publishers further claim that books have been removed, quote, without regard to their literary, artistic, political, scientific, or educational value when taken as a whole. Books like A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens and The Diary of a Young Girl by Anne Frank are among the books that have been banned per the complaint. To be clear, the publishers said that they do not seek to prevent Florida school districts from ensuring that school libraries do not contain obscene books. They just argue books are getting described as pornographic when they are not remotely obscene. Supporters of the law, however, argue Florida is protecting students from obscene content while giving greater control to families over their children's education. A spokeswoman for the state education department said in a statement that the lawsuit was, quote, a stunt and there are no banned books in Florida. Sexually explicit material and instruction are not suitable for schools. And Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has previously said inappropriate material has been snuck into our classrooms and libraries to sexualize our students. It's worth noting that over 4,000 books were removed from schools across 23 states last year. Per free speech organization PEN America, Florida had more books challenged for removal than any other state. So I don't know, Amber, it seems like common sense that there's a review process. The parents maybe put page numbers and a paragraph reference for what they're talking about. If there's a book of concern that has sexual content in it, they review it. They say, oh, yes, this does. This is, inappropriate for this age range. And then they ban it. It seems that the issue here is that there's no review process built into the law.
My understanding is there is a review process. It's just that previously how the Florida law worked is that parents did not have an ability to object to obscene content. Now they do. These books are still supposed to go through a review process through the school board. They're not just supposed to be immediately removed from libraries based on a parental complaint. And the process has been revised several times as well. So back in April, the governor, Ron DeSantis, signed an order making sure that people were not able to take books out in bad faith. So there was an issue where some people who were on the opposite side of the political spectrum were deliberately objecting to books that were not pornographic to see if they would get removed. And so they've been trying to basically streamline the process, but also make it more robust so that that type of thing doesn't happen. I haven't seen any evidence besides the stated claim in the lawsuit that books like A Tale of Two Cities have actually been removed from school libraries. But I would say that generally speaking, there has always been content moderation in school libraries. It has never been the case that every single book, regardless of content, is allowed to be on the shelves of a public school library. Now, it's a different question if you're talking about a public library that's outside of a school system that's not targeted just towards children. But when you have kids who are in the library, it's always been the case that, again, there are certain books that are not allowed there. I think it would be fair to say that a lot of parents would probably not be too pleased if their children were able to access things like Mein Kampf without a teacher, instructing them through the process or without parental approval. So this is pretty much par for the course of how we have always envisioned what schools are supposed to allow kids to have access to. It's never been just no holds barred, you're allowed to read whatever book you want. And Florida has just made it so that explicitly sexual content is included in the laws in terms of content moderation in the education system.
Yeah, it seems with like books by Anne Frank, The Diary of Anne Frank, A Tale of Two Cities, that these kind of books, and I'm sure there are young adult novels that may be, more obscene than what you would want a first grader to read, but are a part of what it means to be growing up and a part of the books that someone might want to read in middle school or in their early teens, that do have some obscene content. We allow for, sex scenes in movies. for younger age people. We allow, kissing in PG-13, mature conversations in PG-13. And there are some schools that have K through 12 students in them. And so it seems to me a challenge. How do we get it to a place where these books are not books that a young kid in first grade can wander over to the shelves and read these young adult novels that are more intended for like an eighth grader? I think that's up to the schools and maybe banning these books altogether so that someone who's in their teen years has access to books that are appropriate for the reading age that maybe a first grader doesn't. I think that's very reasonable, and we've got to strike a happy medium here because I do think that these books that are banned that should be accessible to people who are in their early teens. They haven't had access to them. That is a free speech concern, I think. And so having them banned from the libraries, I don't think is the solution, but I do think, moderating the content so that the age range the book's intended for has access to it, but those younger don't. It seems possible. It doesn't seem that complicated. I believe our severely underfunded public schools can actually pull that off.
Yeah, I generally agree. And I remember in my public school that there were some age restrictions on who was allowed to check out certain books based on whether or not they were considered young adult or children's books. But I think we have to go back to why this law was first enacted. And it was because parents found legitimate pornography in the school libraries. This was a problem in Virginia as well, where a parent went to a school board meeting with a book that she had found in her child's library and tried to read the contents of it and was told by the school board that it had too many adult themes to even be read in a public meeting. So why was it allowed in the school library? They didn't really answer that question. And some of the books that were found in the schools include things like Genderqueer, which had graphic discussions about masturbation and oral sex. There were books like Let's Talk About It, which was available for middle schoolers in some schools that featured naked drawings of people, as well as things like how to use butt plugs and how to anal douche, downplaying STDs, and telling children to research fantasies and kinks. This Book is Gay is another one that has been removed from school libraries in a lot of places that had other descriptions of oral sex in glossary terms, including information about fetishes. So I think when we look at it in the context of the fact that these books are obviously not supposed to be in school libraries, they should not be accessible to kids of any age. Any minor who gets access to content like that has the possibility of being groomed. Those should be removed. And now the questions about some of the other books that maybe have been caught in this dragnet is legitimate and reasonable, but it's not a reason to reject out of hand, I think, the fact that sexually explicit material has no place in a school library.
Yeah, it's fascinating how many of these books are in Florida. Casey Meehan, who's the PEN America's Freedom to Read program director, has been really focusing on these books banned in Florida. And this is where I think the law goes too far for me, is I don't want a Florida state official determining what my child would read if I was a parent in Florida in any state. I don't want that to be up to someone who got elected to the Board of Ed. I just don't. I think that should be up to the parent and whoever writes the book, determining the age range and the general, publisher's idea of what the age range should be. But Casey Meehan said the majority of books that we're seeing removed are books that talk about LGBTQ plus identities, that include characters of color, that talk about race and racism, and that depict sexual experiences. I remember being in fifth grade, and you get the book about puberty. And yes, there are, you see what someone without clothes on looks like, and there's mature conversations in there. And so at fifth grade and up, these kids are aware what sex is. They know what it means to be gay, probably. And so this idea that a Florida state official can say, no, I wouldn't want my kid to read that, so your kid can't either. That's what I have a problem with. It seems like a huge concern for parents' rights and for civil liberties.
My pushback there would be that you still have the opportunity to show these books to your kids if you want to. They're just not accessible in a school library. So if you wanted to take your kid to the public library or if you wanted to order the book online, you still have the right as a parent to do that. But your right as a parent to show your kids that material shouldn't mean that it's accessible to every kid in the school library whose parents might object to it. So that would be where the balance, I think, needs to be struck, is Just because the book is not easily accessible at the middle school library doesn't mean your kid doesn't have access to it or doesn't have the right to read it, or that you as a parent can't allow them to read it. You just have to go to a different venue for that.
I think the parent in that case could just say, you're not allowed to check out, X, Y, and Z book. Give their kid a list when they go to school. Hey, in the library today, these are the books that I would like for you not to check out. They can have their own list of banned books for their own kids and send them off to school with them. That seems like a pretty easy solution rather than pulling books from the shelves that our tax dollars have already paid for because some parents have different ideas of what's mature content or not. I think that that's fully reasonable and pretty easy to implement.
But some of these are just objectively sexually explicit material. And I do think that there's also a line where parents should have rights, of course, but those rights are limited in the sense that you shouldn't have the right to expose your kid to content that is not age appropriate, meaning content that is sexually explicit, and not just for instructional type material reasons. So for example, showing your kids information about sexual fetishes is not something that you would have a right to do as a parent. Exposing your children to pornography intentionally is not something you have a right to do as a parent. Child abuse is not something you have a right to do as a parent. So there's always been limitations that we have in society on parental rights. We try to maximize parental rights because we recognize that sometimes abuse from one person's eyes is normal parenting in another person's eyes. But we also have objective standards that we expect people to abide by when they're raising children. And that's what I see happening here in Florida.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that some parents are going to let their kids read books that depict sexually explicit content. I mean, I remember being a tween and reading the Twilight series. There's some sexually explicit content in that series. It didn't scar me permanently. Was it a bad on my parents to allow me to read that book? I don't think so. I think at a certain age before you're 18, reading books that talk about sex is okay, especially considering the age of consent between two people under the age of 18 is pretty common in states. So the idea that you could have sex but not read or learn about it, I think is a little bit scary because I think doing the reading and learning about it is pretty essential to make sure you do it safely. And a lot of the statistics around people receiving public health education, especially around sex, there's a correlation to having safer sex, less STDs, less teen pregnancy. I think some reading material about sex is actually okay under the age of 18, considering it's fully legal for kids to engage in sex. So I think some of that is okay if kids have access to that. And if parents don't like it, it makes them uncomfortable. They can raise their kid with certain restrictions. But I always think we have a country that allows more access to information rather than less, within reason. It's not a book that's totally pornography, but a young adult novel that's storytelling with some mature themes, I think is okay.
And I completely agree with you. Like the Twilight series talks about people engaging in sex, but here's the difference. And I would end with this question for you. Do you think that there is a difference between reading about two people engaging in a lovemaking act, let's say, versus an instructional diagram that tells children as young as 10 or 11 how to insert a butt plug?
I don't think that's inappropriate for someone 10 or 11 years old, but I think 13 and up, that's okay. That's a part of sex for a lot of people.
All right, then that's where we'll have to agree to disagree. We'll be back with more Rising after this.